let's talk a little bit about China and the U.S. and what that means for Australia, because that relationship with China has been on ice. Is this a new normal?
Well, I think the partial stabilization of U.S. China relations coming out of the recent summit between Xi Jinping and President Biden is, on balance, good news for the wider region. Because it takes the geopolitical temperature down a notch or two. That actually creates more political space for other bilateral relationships, either with Japan and China, Republic of Korea and China, Australia and China, to enter, I would hope, into a less fractious period. But I think strategically, whatever the tactical pause may be, whatever the tactical stabilization may be for the year ahead, strategically we still face a very rough competitive period.
Is that just because of the nature of Beijing under President Xi Jinping's leadership, or is some of the blame here in the relationship also falling on the Australian government?
Look, there's a structural factor here, which is, number one, China's rise. It's now more powerful. It's adjusted the regional balance of power as a consequence between China and the United States, and obviously between China, the US, and its allies. So that's a big underpinning dynamic. Military power, economic power, trade power, investment power, technology power, you name it. The second thing is Xi Jinping's strategy has changed from that of his predecessors. Remember Deng Xiaoping? Hide your strength, bide your time, never take the lead. Now, Xi Jinping has put that in the can, and we have a different approach, a much more assertive Chinese foreign policy and strategic policy. But the bottom line is the Australian government, in my own judgment, has not played this particularly well. Sometimes when China has been excessively assertive, the Australian government often responds rhetorically to cater to its own domestic political constituency, as opposed to pursuing what I would describe as a rational, long-term, hard-edged, hard-nosed bilateral strategy towards China.
I love hearing you speak in Mandarin. So from those conversations that you're having with Chinese policymakers on the ground, what do you get, what feeling are you getting about what their intentions are, especially when they look at their role in the world in the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, I'm handicapped like everybody else because I haven't been to China for 18 months. So I deal with our Chinese interlocutors on Zoom, and some, of course, a very small number outside the country as well. I think it's along these lines. For the 12 months ahead in the lead up to the 20th Party Congress at the end of next year, which on balance will confirm Xi Jinping as China's paramount leader for the long-term future, in my judgment, through to 2035. But for the 12 months leading up to that, I believe it's in Beijing's interest to bring the strategic temperature down. Hence China's interest in having this bilateral summit with President Biden. But China's long-term strategy, however, does not ultimately change. It wants to regain Taiwan. It wants to push the United States back strategically from East Asia and the West Pacific, and it wants to become the dominant economic footprint across this hemisphere.
Does it want to regain Taiwan, or do they prefer the status quo?
China definitely wants to regain Taiwan. If you look at the entrails of the Chinese internal discourse on this, as people like myself are engaged to do, the bottom line is Xi Jinping says we cannot achieve 中华大复兴, the great renaissance of the Chinese people, by 2049 without Taiwan. It's what he describes in Chinese as a 必然要求, an inevitable requirement. Therefore, we are on, whether we like it or not, a 30-year timetable in the mind of the Chinese policy and political elites. The one thing that would deter China from ultimately taking military action would be for the United States to maintain an effective military deterrence with the Taiwanese in the period ahead.
How much would it help the other multilateral groupings such as AUKUS or the Quad or the Five Eyes? Because Australia seems to be emphasizing these groupings. I wonder how this is being taken by other of Australia's neighbors. Because if the point here is to lower the temperature, wouldn't these groupings sort of provoke more of Beijing's ire?
Well, here we are in Southeast Asia, in Singapore at the moment. Our ASEAN friends, all 10 of them, at one level will express some public reservations about new geopolitical arrangements. For example, the Quad. which links Japan, India, Australia and the United States. But at a different level, at a private level, if you have quiet discussions with many of these governments, they're kind of pleased that the Quad has arrived because it provides further geopolitical counterbalancing against China, which provides them with more foreign policy space and autonomy to work in their own bilateral dealings with the Chinese, including on the South China Sea. So we need to always differentiate between public position and substantive operational positions on the part of governments.
And of course, we know who wasn't pleased with the AUKUS meetings. Europe and France, specifically because of that submarine building contract. Is the EU FTA at risk here?
With Australia?
Yes.
France is never a good country to have alienated completely. I think the Australian government under Mr Morrison mismanaged the AUKUS arrangement by keeping the French in the dark. My own recommendation has always been, if the technical specifications for Australia's next submarine fleet is changed from conventional boats, which is what I commissioned when I was Prime Minister, to nuclear-powered boats, well, let's assume that technical advice is correct. But what the Australian government should have done is then reopen the tender to the French and the British and the Americans to then tender for a new $90 billion project, rather than just rule the French out. So therefore, if you've alienated the French, my experience of French diplomacy around the world is that they can be problematic. So if I was Mr Morrison, I would be finding a way through this as rapidly as possible in order to make sure that this is put to bed as quickly as possible.
If you were Mr. Morrison, what would you do about climate policy? Because that's another area where he's taken a lot of heat.
Well, I would do something about climate policy as opposed to nothing about climate policy, which is currently the Australian government's international and, frankly, domestic position. He certainly, quote, found religion, together with the Murdoch media empire, on the question of carbon neutrality by 2050. But at the end of the day, that means nothing unless you've got a robust target for carbon reduction by 2030. And that because you've got to have a credible stepping up point, not a trajectory like that between 2030 and 2050, which is unrealisable. So he's got to get real about a 2030 target. Interestingly, in Glasgow, the Conference of the Parties said, we're not going to give you 5 years off now. You've got to come back next year. Those countries, including Australia, who have not committed to a 2030 target. So 12 months' time, the acid will be on Australia.